Anytime 50 Cent yells or uses obvious intimidation tactics in public, it is pure theatre. Behind the scenes, he is cool and calculating. His lack of fear is displayed in his attitude and his actions. He has seen and lived through too many dangerous encounters on the street to be remotely fazed by anything. If a deal is not to his liking, he will walk away and not care. If he needs to play a little rough and dirty with an adversary, he goes at it without second thought. He feels supreme confidence in himself. Living in a world where most people are generally timid and conservative, he always has the advantage of being willing to do more, to take risks, and to be unconventional. Coming from an environment in which he never expected to live past the age of 25, he feels like he has nothing to lose, and this brings him tremendous power. And this is a quote from a book called The 50th Law, which was co-authored by 50 Cent, Curtis Jackson, but mainly written by Robert Greene as a book about 50 Cent and the laws that could be distilled from his life. And this was actually one of two books on 50 Cent that I read in preparation for this special first episode of Icons, which is a new podcast where I talk about the work and minds of the greatest artists, from painters, musicians, filmmakers, fashion designers, writers, and more. And what will lead me to each episode is my passion, my desire to uncover and learn more about the greatest artists that walked among us. And this was partly inspired by a great podcast I love listening to by the great David Senra called the Founders Podcast. And Founders takes insights from biographies in the world of entrepreneurship. And I thought, what kind of people am I drawn to? You know, in the same passionate way that David Senra is clearly drawn to inventors and creators and disruptors, who are the types that I'm drawn to? And for years now, I've watched documentaries and followed the work and lives of a lot of artists. You know, artists to me are people who have to work in a world in which we're told traditionally has a lot of rules. There are certain ways to make art. There are certain ways to educate yourself in art. But I found the greatest artists, the ones we admire, are all the rule breakers. And 50 Cent is no exception from the rule. In fact, he himself didn't develop an education or an understanding of art through a formal education, let's say from an art school or something, but instead learnt it from reality, from the streets, from very, very humble backgrounds, and, you know, and took all of the energy from that place and turned it into a body of work and a lifetime and a career of different art forms, as we'll later learn. It feels special to me to start with 50 Cent because he was my first hip-hop music artist that I ever listened to. You know, a lot of people, perhaps those born in the 80s, may have stories of their first music experiences or their first experiences with music coming from that of mixtapes, be it in tape form or CD form. Perhaps they had a friend who was really good at putting together these mixtapes. I feel like I've heard lots of these types of stories before of new artists, new up-and-coming artists. Perhaps someone had, you know, the right connections, let's say, legal or not, that allowed them to gather, you know, the type of music that perhaps wasn't traditionally playing on the radio, where you didn't have to sit around and wait for the next new release. In fact, you could just have it playing to you on repeat through CD format or otherwise. For me, my version of that was in the 2000s, and it was through a family friend of ours who had an iTunes account, something I didn't have at the time. And so there was no means of me being able to access music so easily. And it required me instead to go to him and take my iPod Nano at the time. It was the third generation iPod Nano, worth looking up because they are a relic now, but it was something I would take to my family friends and say, please, whatever music you have, I would love to have it. And 50 Cent was an artist that he loved, and he passed on to me. I had the Get Rich or Die Trying album and the Massacre album, the first two albums he released, on my iPod Nano, and I just fell in love. I think there was something so raw and so powerful about his beat selection, but also his words in particular, that made his art so deep And despite my background not being one that perhaps resonates all that deeply with 50 Cent's background, I knew there was something deeper. I knew there was something that sat below the surface within his words that I was always drawn to. But I recently picked up Hustle Harder, Hustle Smarter, which is a book written by 50 Cent. And it's an autobiography of sorts, but it really revealed so much that sat below the surface. Something I knew about 50 Cent but could never really articulate, which was that he appeared as this very thuggish character, you know, with a lot of energy and a kind of a palpable force behind him. And yet there always sat this kind of cool, collected, calm version of him that it was harder to access. And his book was one of those avenues. And another avenue is if you watch any business-related interview with him, you can see his business mind kick in. And I think this is a fundamental piece to his artistry, because it's the very part of him that is observant of the world and reality around him, and the thing that allows him to pull the almost the well for him to pull from in order to create the lifetime of work that he has created over many decades. And so before we get into both the book Hustle Harder, Hustle Smarter and the 50th Law, I'm going to just run through a little fact list as to his life. I think it's worth it for those who might not be familiar with Curtis Jackson or 50 Cent's kind of life story, because there is a lot there and it's worth kind of going over. He was born in South Jamaica neighborhood of Queens, and this plays a prominent character throughout his music, actually, as a backdrop to the stories he tells. Unfortunately, his mother died when he was the age of 8, and his mother was a single parent. 50 Cent never knew his father, but his mother was a drug dealer and involved in a world of crime that unfortunately took her out. And it left 50 Cent with his grandparents at the age of 8. But his grandparents was a busy home, and it meant that he couldn't get undivided attention, and it left him to himself a lot. And it meant that he went to places such as the boxing gym that he references a lot in his book as a place where he learned many lessons. And he joined that boxing gym at 11. So you can imagine this 11-year-old. I mean, think about yourself at 11. Were you fighting guys, you know, older than you and bigger than you and stronger than you? Perhaps not, but perhaps you didn't have the same drive and desire to be seen and heard that 50 Cent might have had at that age. What unfortunately happened there, though, is that there were some influences around the boxing gym that took 50 Cent on a new path, which is that he saw drug dealers outside the gym often, and they always had these flashy clothes, cars, jewelry, and really in the world that he lived in within the neighborhood of Queens, you know, that's what success looked like. And that's the only model of success he had to go off. Not having a parental figure in his life that perhaps would have given him a steering back to a more traditional path. He could only see freedom, what looked like freedom to him, and success in the lives lived by the drug dealers in his world. And him, you know, knowing perhaps at this age that his mother was also a drug dealer, this is really all he knew. And so by the age of 14, he was arrested for bringing drugs into school, as he had started his first career effectively in the drug world, selling crack on the streets. And this would really catch him up as by the age of 17, he was actually arrested after the police searched his house to find heroin, coke, and 15 grand in cash. And it meant that, you know, his life would have taken a sharp descent at this point, but being 17 and considered a teen facing their first felony, it meant that he didn't go to jail, but instead went to a boot camp for 6 months, a kind of military boot camp. But it was actually at the age of 21 that he met and signed with Jam Master Jay of Run DMC and his label. And this was in 1996. At the age of 22, so this is a year into his new music career. If you're wondering how that transition even happened, how you could go from drug dealer to being signed to Jam Master Jay's label, Yeah, we'll get into that. This is going to be a big piece of the story. He then moved over to Columbia Records, Sony's music label, in 1999 at the age of 24, which is where he recorded what would have been his debut album, Power of the Dollar. But this is where a very fundamental part of his story and a very crucial part of his story comes about, which is that at the age of 25, in the year of 2000, he was actually shot 9 times. And this is a story that I think a lot of people know about 50 Cent. Even if you know very little about 50 Cent, this will be one of the things that sits in your mind as something that happened to him. But perhaps the details aren't so clear around it, or what happened after that. How is it that, firstly he survived, and what were the ramifications of his survival, and why does he seem like, such a calm, collected individual despite that kind of horrific violence happening in his life? These are all things, again, we will get into, as they are a key part of what makes the artist 50 Cent. As a result of being shot 9 times and all the violence surrounding his life, he was actually dropped by Columbia Records before the release of his album, Power of the Dollar. And if you want to know about the height of which this would have been, and what this would have been for his career, being signed to Columbia Records and having that first debut album come out, if you can actually find that album, Power of the Dollar, on YouTube. It is a great album. You really see that this guy had a mastery over his words and work from the very beginning. But he actually had a feature with Destiny's Child and on his album. And that really just goes to show, we're talking about Beyonce, one of the greatest and highest selling artists of all time, being featured on his song. And he was actually going to record a music video for the song, which is to coincide with the release of the album, but that never happened for the fact that he was shot and dropped from the record. But in 2001, a year later, he comes out with a single called Fuck You, and apologies for any profanity throughout this, but it's going to be quite necessary when it comes to discussing 50 Cent's lyrics and artistry. And he comes out with this song, and then in 2002, forgive me, he went on a mixtape run, a prolific mixtape run that we'll get into, which is crucial for the fact that one of the mixtapes, Guess Who's Back, you can imagine why it's called that after his shooting, later fell into the hands of Eminem, who actually signed him to his label Shady Records, which was sat within Dr. Dre's Aftermath Entertainment and Interscope Records, which produced and helped produce in 2003 one of the biggest debut albums in hip-hop, Get Rich or Die Trying. And you probably know this album. Everyone's listened to this album. It features songs like In the Club, Pimp, Many Men Wish Death, 21 Questions, and If I Can't, which is an incredible gym song if you've ever listened to one. And, Interscope Records loved, obviously, this release and loved the potential and the fulfilling of potential of 50 Cent so much that they actually gave him his own label, G-Unit Records, where he would go on to sign artists like Lloyd Banks, Tony Yayo, Young Buck, Mobb Deep, Olivia, M.O.P., and The Game. And in 2005, he would have similar success with his second album, The Massacre. And in the same year, the film Get Rich or Die Trying, the same title as his first album, which was a semi-autobiographical film starring 50 Cent as himself and about his life. But since then, he's put out 3 more albums with the label. I think a 4th if you include his best of album. And he's had various business deals, most famously having his vitamin water deal, which he started in 2004, I believe, becoming extremely lucrative in 2007, not 3 years later, when Coca-Cola actually bought the owners of vitamin water for $4.1 billion. Really cementing any security that 50 Cent wanted for his life, but also established him as someone that sat outside of just the artistry of hip-hop, but was actually an entrepreneur also. But he also acted in a lot of films since the Get Rich or Die Trying film came out. And I'd say more importantly, he moved into the role of a TV producer and started the show Power in 2014, which was a huge success and now has numerous spin-offs co-signed by Starz TV network, but all under his company, G-Unit Films and Television Inc. We're talking about a man who, started off as a drug dealer, but later found himself to becoming a hip hop artist, a pioneer in some regards there, and having a tremendously successful career from that, but then also transitioning into films and later television, all whilst also doing the kind of business deals that cemented him and made him infamous for being this entrepreneur, mogul type figure, as well as being a rapper. Something that you will later learn is very intentional on 50 Cent's behalf. So let's get into it. I'm going to go through notes that I've taken from reading those two books I mentioned earlier, and draw out what I believe to be the key lessons for any artist to take away and put into their own work. And you will see how 50 Cent is a much deeper and richer character than he may portray himself to be. It's worth noting a key lesson from 50's work is that 50 Cent carves art from reality. And we'll go back to the key story of him being shot 9 times at the age of 25. And this was, of course, an event that took place only a few weeks before the release date of what would have been his debut album at the time, Power of the Dollar. And I'm going to go to quotes from the 50th Law to speak on this event. In a flash, all the momentum he had built up reversed itself. Columbia cancelled the release of the record and dropped 50 from his contract. There was too much violence associated with him. It was bad for business. A few inquiries made it clear that other labels felt the same. He was being blackballed from the industry. In just a few short weeks, he had gone from being poised for fame and fortune to hitting the bottom, and there seemed to be no way to move out of the corner he found himself in. But as he lay in his bed at his grandparents' house, recovering from the wounds, he listened to a lot of radio, and what he heard gave him an incredible rush of optimism. An idea started to take shape in his mind that the shooting was in fact a great blessing in disguise. And I want to take a side note here on this idea that, again, he said that the shooting was perhaps a great blessing in disguise. This is something that very few people would have, but 50 Cent had because he's an artist. And I think that his artistic temperament gives him an opportunistic lens to see negative situations as material. I want to quote even Robert Greene himself when he advises his protege and now prolific writer Ryan Holiday, when he says that everything is material. To treat yourself like Don Draper from the character of Mad Men, to see everything in your life as potential material for your work and your art. 50 Cent was doing this even whilst lying on the sofa to the radio. He wasn't just listening to the radio to pass time or for entertainment. He was listening to the radio with the ear bent towards creativity and gaps where he could fill. He didn't see himself having fallen off or dropped from the spotlight. He saw himself being enabled to continue his artistry. And I think when you have this artistic lens throughout your life, you don't ever see the peaks and troughs in your career as moments. You actually see your whole life as one continuous path from which you can derive insights and ideas for your craft. And your craft is this ongoing artistic expression throughout your life, no matter where you are. The book would later say, the music on the radio was also packaged and produced. Even the tough stuff, the gangster rap, was fake. The lyrics did not reflect anything from the streets that he knew. The attempt to pass it off as real and urban angered him to the point he could not endure. And I love this idea that it angered him to the point he could not endure. I love this line because it really highlights the anger, this deeper emotion that perhaps people would veer away from in their lives on a day-to-day and see as this perhaps distracting and more dark and nefarious spirit that they don't want in their lives, actually reveals itself to be a source of inspiration and a source from which he can actually start to create art. Two actually artists come to mind. One is that of Casey Neistat, a YouTuber who's notorious as a YouTuber now, but when he first started his YouTube career, he created this brilliant short film video called Bike Lanes, and it's really worth looking up because it's a brilliant, fun piece that highlights Casey Neistat's very scrappy nature that's made him famous now. But at the time, all he did was he took a moment he was frustrated and angered. He was fined by the New York State for not cycling in the bike lane. And he highlighted that there are lots of reasons, lots of physical obstacles that sat as reasons as to why he couldn't continuously cycle in the bike lane. And rather than perhaps, writing an angry note or something, he decided to make a film, to make art that highlights this. And the video hilariously shows him kind of cycling through the bike lane and just hitting obstacles. I think I recall an interview he once did where he said how easy it was for him to film this because there were just so many obstacles. And I think he even made a subsequent video about it years later where he said this problem still continues till this day. And the video even ends beautifully and ironically with him cycling into a police car that sat parked in a bike lane, which comes full circle. So there is something in anger that can be a source and a well for inspiration and art. Jerry Seinfeld, the creator of Seinfeld, obviously, also created a show called Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, which is just as how the name suggests. It is about he and another comedian getting into a car and driving and going to have coffee. And that's the show. Each episode sits in that kind of format. But what it means is that the simple format allows for this very naturalistic, beautiful flowing of conversation, either about artists, about the art of comedy. And I'll probably do an episode on Jerry Seinfeld because he's a very fascinating character, whether you like him or not. And he managed to create this by being inspired from a place of anger. He would watch the kind of talk shows that appeared, late night talk shows that appeared over history. And although he places credit and respect towards a lot of the hosts of those shows, he said the format was stifled and it was lacking of inspiration and innovation because it had this kind of boring couch formula that felt very false and not real, which is interesting because 50 Cent also has now noted that the music he was listening to did not sound real and authentic. And similarly, Jerry Seinfeld also felt that way about a celebrity or a new actor coming to promote a film or a comedian coming to these events. And the whole event feeling more like a press thing rather than this real authentic lens into these celebrities or famous people's and artists' lives. And so he took the anger and decided to take that formula that was now feeling stagnant and take it to the road. Literally, he would create a mood that felt very real and authentic. And what I love about the show, which is something I've actually rewatched many times, is that it feels very much like a casual and enjoyable morning that you might have with a close friend. It has and contains that sort of mood. The content itself is not something of the conversations even is not something that draws you back in. It's the mood of the show. It's the feeling of spontaneity and flow of conversation, that beautiful art in itself that Jerry Seinfeld captures in his show, something that can't be unlocked from normal late night talk shows that he had watched. And his anger actually drove him to create something himself. So, whenever you find yourselves angry at something, look in that anger, be introspective and examine what is it that you don't like, because perhaps the opposite of that is where your art can come from. This was the moment to convert all his anger and dark emotions into a powerful campaign that would shake the very foundations of hip hop. I've returned to Robert Greene's writing here because it's just so addictive and he's such a great writer. He, as we'll continue, as a hustler on the streets, 50 had learned a fundamental lesson. Access to money and resources is severely limited in the hood. A hustler must transform every little event and every trifling object into some gimmick for making money. Even the worst shit that happens to you can be converted into gold if you are clever enough. It's worth noting here that when he was down, as we noted earlier, and he was listening to the radio, he was actually in a walker for 6 weeks or so, and it only fully recovered after 5 months. So, you can imagine, having been shot 9 times and being down, it's not like he was now recovered quickly and he was, himself in his physical form. No, he was really requiring a type of therapy and a rehab from his home, a home in which he didn't always feel safe either. When he notes at one point to go outside, he had to have a companion with him, in case the people that were out to get him, who were still out there. I mean, one of the people who was linked closely with the shooting actually died, but it's not like the gang disappeared. So, 50 Cent didn't feel safe either. So it's in this environment that he's still trying to create art, which is just inspiring. Back to the book. He decided to disappear for a few months and holed up in various friends' houses. He began to recreate himself and his music career. With no executives to have to please or worry about, he could push his lyrics and the hard sound as far as he wanted. And I just want to stress that. I mean, he was seeing not the dropping of himself from Columbia Records as a negative. He was seeing it as something that was freeing. He was now stepping away from the perhaps sales pitch that the record companies give artists, which is that of enablement and being able to help distribute artists' work far and wide, and instead saw that they would likely place limits on what he could actually say, which was necessary for him to break out of in order to get to the real and hard truths that he wanted to represent in his work. It's also worth going back to the book here because it says his voice had changed as a result of the pieces of bullet still lodged in his tongue. It now had a hiss. It was still painful for him to move his mouth, so he had to rap more slowly. Instead of trying to normalize and retrain his voice, he was determined to turn it into a virtue. His new style of rapping would be more deliberate and menacing. That hiss would remind listeners of the bullet that had gone through his jaw. Wow, talk about turning something from bad to good. It's worth talking about his voice for a moment, because if you listen to the music that he produced before this event in the 2000s, you realize how different he sounded. He had this kind of energy to his voice that was, very loud and energetic and angry, the type of emotions we talked about now when it comes to 50 Cent's work. But actually, there is a key difference between that and that of his voice after he was shot. He does sound much more muted, and some would argue that perhaps, he is able to articulate less. But I think there's something that comes from his required economical nature that means that he's more in that brevity. He's a lot more precise with the words, and he is a bit more deliberate in the way that he's able to communicate what is real about his experiences. And it's also worth noting that his grandma, whilst he was hospitalized, when he was initially hospitalized, requested that he didn't have a surgery, because the risk with the surgery was that he would have actually lost his voice. And, his grandma recognized that his voice was so important to him. It was a big part of who he was going to be. And so, understanding that potential, she thought perhaps he would have to live a bit more in pain, but the trade-off there was just not worth it for him to potentially lose his voice in reducing his pain. It was better for him to have lived with the pain, knowing that he could still rap. So an amazing thing his grandma did there for him. Then in the summer of 2001, he reappeared, just as kind of, as you can imagine, people just start to forget about him, forget about that story of him being shot, and that kind of falls out of the news cycle. He releases his first song to the streets, and it's called Fuck You. And the song, as it talks about in the 50th Law, the lyrics summarizing how he felt about his killers and everyone who wanted him to go away. Just putting out the song was message enough. He was defying his assassins openly and publicly. 50 was back. And to shut him up, they would have to finish the job. The palpable anger in his voice and the hard driving sound of the song made it a sensation on the streets. And this song, Fuck You, later featured in the mixtape Guess Who's Back, as we'll get into his mixtapes later and the relevance of Guess Who's Back as an album is really worth listening to hear the energy. And very few artists that probably have gone through such an event like that and have a piece of work that you can learn about and immerse yourself in that comes off the back of that, and to feel the energy of him wanting to fight his way back into the industry and show his relevance, and to show that he still has a lot to give. In fact, he had only just started, and arguably this event itself, as he would later say in his song 9 Shots, that he really shaped him. It was 9 shots, but it became 50. It became the thing that defined 50 Cent and everything he produced. Back to the book, it also came with an added punch. Because he seemed to be inviting more violence, the public had to grab up everything he produced before he was killed. The life and death angle made for a compelling spectacle. Wow. Can you imagine an artist that you love listening today, but a new and up-and-coming artist, having the threat of possible death linger over every piece of work they put out? Can you imagine the kind of pull that would have, and how much you would desire to listen to everything they put out? Remember that this was not of the time of streaming music, so it wasn't, you couldn't even trust in the idea that you'd be able to listen to it later, or there would be an easy release of a posthumous album. No, we're talking about, I need to go out to the store and buy every possible thing that 50 Cent puts out, just in case that's the last thing he ever puts out. With the price still on his head, he could not go to concerts or do any kind of public promotion, but somehow he turned even this into a marketing device. Hearing his music everywhere, but not being able to see him, only added to the mystique and the attention people paid him. That kind of mystique, I think, is so crucial in artistry. A lot of the artists that perhaps we admire are those who are a little bit bathed in this idea of mystique. And I think it's an idea that I want to revisit a lot throughout the podcast run. But I think, at least in my mind right away, artists like The Weeknd, Abel Tesfaye's artist name, comes straight to mind. When he released, and we'll do an episode on him, but when he released his first 3 mixtapes, later named the trilogy, he actually was so unknown at the time, and actually goes on to do so few interviews, that for a big portion of his initial career, people listened to him, would hear this angelic voice over the type of dark beats they'd never really heard before, with lyrics that were also contrasting the angelic voice with their dark nature. And they would wonder, is this a band? Is this an artist? It was so hard to unlock the truth within the mystique, but there was something so dark and true about the words. And I think there was something very captivating about that. And so just be conscious of that as an artist as well, to not put yourself as out there as perhaps you might think, at least if you want to create the idea of mystique around your work, to invite people in with truth, but then not to reveal who you are in the truth, is fascinating, and I think would help to develop that. So you can see already that there is a deep awareness of truth and reality, and it's this awareness and also image that I want to kind of get into further here as we move on to another important lesson. When you read 50 Cent's book, or read about him, or watch him in any interview, you realize how self-aware 50 Cent is. Arguably the most self-aware person to come out of the hip-hop world, bar maybe someone like Jay-Z or Tupac. But 50 Cent was extremely self-aware. He says himself, because I'm known as a pretty aggressive guy who moves quickly towards the action, it might surprise you to learn that one of my greatest negotiating strengths is actually patience. No matter how much money is on the table, how much pressure I'm under, or however good or bad my last venture performed, I will always wait for the best deal before I commit. And although he might be talking about his business practice here and his mindset, it does reveal how he is revealed and known to be this aggressive person, and yet in reality he is something else. And that contrast is again the thing that pulled me towards him as an artist, but is also something he's very intentional about. He also manipulates image. He says, well, not just that he says, but also he makes songs like High All the Time, which features in the Get Rich or Die Trying album. And in that same album, he also brags about having a bottle full of bub in the song In the Club. and yet in reality he doesn't do drugs, and for the most part doesn't drink. And he actually makes a big point in his book about, not ever relying on anything, including these type of things. But it's really interesting how he will still manipulate the image and cater to those who perhaps enjoy that aspect of the hip hop culture, and he will create in as authentic a way as possible there. But in reality, he doesn't even placate to the vices that he's talking about. Back to a quote of his, he says, "Influencing how people perceive you doesn't make you fake. It doesn't make you phony. It makes you someone who knows how to control energy to your advantage." And if anyone knows how to do that, it's 50 Cent. He even notes this perception change of him in the media. He says, "I've noticed a trend in how the media covers me. When I'm killing it, I'm known as the music mogul 50 Cent. But let something bad happen, and then I'm the rapper 50 Cent." And so he's even conscious of words and the power of words, and pays attention to the associations and that might come to mind for people as they hear those words, and how they would view someone like 50 Cent differently based on those words. And naturally, being a rapper, a manipulator of words, he's going to use that to his advantage. There's a pivotal moment that if you recall the fact list I went through earlier in his history, that moved him from being someone who was dealing with a crime on the streets to being a music artist. That's quite a big jump, at least it was for him. And I said that I would fill in the gap as to how he did that. Well, it comes about when he sets the intention. He wants to go and work in the music industry. It was something he was already drawn to, but he knew he needed, at least at that time, access. And there was no better place, especially in New York, than Bentley's to get that access. Bentley's was a club, a very exclusive music club that actually live streamed its, or maybe not live stream, but at least put out their club nights on Saturday night onto the radio. And it meant that, it attracted the attention of a lot of people in the music world. It was a place that drew celebrities, models, sports stars, and so on. And so if you wanted to be in the music industry, or if you wanted to be a somebody in the music industry, what better place to go to than the place where all the people who wanted to do well in that world were already gathering and already kind of enjoying conversations amongst themselves about perhaps their next deal or the next project that we're going to be working on. But of course, to get into somewhere like this, you had to be somebody already. There was a bouncer. They weren't just going to let anyone and everyone in. And for it to maintain that exclusivity. And so 50 Cent pulls up one day with a few of his friends, and they sit outside the club in his Mercedes 400 SE. And that becomes a pivotal part of the story, because he actually sits outside and they think about how they're gonna get in. And then Jam Master Jay of Run DMC actually bangs on the hood of his car, and thinking it's someone else, thinking, as we'll later learn, that he was an NBA player. And it turns out he wasn't. Of course, it was 50 Cent sat in the car. Jam Master Jay recognizes that and says, "Oh, my bad, I'm sorry." But then 50 Cent gets out of the car and says to him, "Hey, I love what you do. I've actually a rapper myself, and I've actually followed your work for a long time." 50 Cent actually wasn't a rapper at this time, but he said he was. He kind of faked it till he made it, if you will. But there's a reason why he was able to do that, and I'll speak about that in a second. But he actually, in conversation with Jam Master Jay, Jam Master Jay says, "Are you coming into Bentley's?" And he says, "Yeah, we're coming with you." 50 Cent boldly says, "We're actually coming in with you." And Jam Master Jay said, "For sure, come in." And they all went in together, and he then spent the rest of the night with Jam Master Jay. And by the end of that interaction, Jam Master Jay actually signs him to his own, or at least I think first asks him to make a tape for him, and then, having listened to that tape, signs him to his record label. So that was his first entry into the music industry. And to go to, and this was at the age of 21 in the year 1996, and to go to some quotes from his book that he wrote about this. He says, "We would have never gotten in without him. He literally walked me into the music business. Here's the thing. Jay would never have invited me into the club with him if I hadn't been driving a 400 SE. If I just walked up to him on the sidewalk, he wouldn't have even stopped to talk with us, let alone take us inside. Even when it turned out I wasn't really an NBA player, I was still somebody to him. somebody who deserved his attention. And once I had it, it was up to me to capitalize on it, which I did. And, I mentioned this moment as part of his lesson about awareness and perception of who he is and how he appears, and the self-awareness that he has as an artist to recognize that, 50 Cent actually often, he talks in this book, but also in interviews I've heard him talk about the idea that, you might pull up to another car, by a traffic light and ask the guy in that car to roll their window down. And depending on what you're sat in, the guy may or may not roll their window down. So if they're sat in, let's say, a Mercedes themselves, but you're sat in some banged up car, then it's unlikely that they're going to roll their window down. But if you're sat in a Ferrari, then them thinking that you might know something they don't, or at least subconsciously, will roll the window down. It's this idea that we judge people by their covers, or we judge a book by their cover. In fact, the idea that we don't, or we shouldn't judge a book by its cover, in its very nature, reduces what a cover is all about. A cover is a signal to the reader or the potential reader of what information is going to be useful from this upcoming book. It's the thing that draws people in. It's the clue that gives busy people, which we all are, something to take as an insight into what we're about to experience, and whether we should even experience it in the first place. In this instance, the 400 SE Mercedes was enough to give Jam Master Jay an idea that 50 Cent would be someone worth talking to, even if he was a drug dealer. And it's this awareness of image and the awareness that judgment doesn't happen as this moral thing on our behalf when it comes to image. It is simply our subconscious mind looking for clues in this complex world and trying to distill some form of simplicity in order to navigate it and make good decisions quickly, because we have to make a lot of them. So 50, knowing this, talks about this idea of manipulating your image. He says, what I'm sitting in controlled his entire perception of me. 50 then, of course, goes on to make that rough demo track for Jam Master Jay. Jam Master Jay talks about it being this rough and raw thing, but being very real. And we will later learn, of course, as we just learned, that reality is where 50 Cent creates his art from, and what allows him to stand out from the crowd that he was annoyed by. So at the age of 21, Jam Master Jay assigns 50 Cent to his label. And this is actually where Curtis Jackson, at the time, chooses the name 50 Cent. And for those who want to know, he took this name as an idea and a metaphor for change. You can see the double usage of the word change here. There was a moment for him to change, and 50 Cent itself being change. And that he would now be able to do things his way. He saw the music world as an escape from actually the confines and the lack of security that came, or long-term security at least, of the drug and crime world. And he was also inspired by a 1980s Brooklyn robber who was also known as 50 Cent. And he said he chose it, quote, because it says everything I want it to say. I'm the kind of person 50 Cent was. I provide for myself by any means. And perhaps he was saying this slightly for spectacle, as he didn't want to stay in the crime world. And so to speak at this idea that he'll get what he wants for any means sounds almost a little bit nefarious by spirit. But it at least reveals that 50 Cent was going to be prolific no matter what. You could drop him from a label, you can do whatever, you could shoot him 9 times and he was still going to create. He was still going to produce amazing, incredible art that was inspirational, that tapped into audiences that others couldn't tap into, that was going to be successful and award-winning for its truth and its reality and its hard-hitting nature. He says, as I'm shaking your hand, I'm also scanning your entire outfit for whatever clues I can glean from it. Before you open your mouth, your appearance has already initiated a conversation. Make sure it's saying the right thing. And 50 Cent actually does this with fashion. He does this with choosing the people around him. He talks about how when he enters business deals, or when he had to enter especially business deals whilst he was still really perceived as a rapper by the public, he had to tone down this idea and image of being a rapper, something that probably would have played extremely well for the shock value and factor for selling music, was not going to do well from a perception standpoint when it came to him being taken seriously by CEOs of companies and boards. So he would turn up in a suit. Now, you'll see him on a late night interview. He'll wear a 3-piece suit for that matter. He looks like someone who takes himself seriously. And by extension of that perception and how you treat yourself, you're often perceived to be that way also. So others would take him seriously by that very nature. He would also probably be expected as someone who was much more thuggish in public to appear with a group or with an entourage, and instead would actually turn up by himself or potentially a lawyer. That kind of seriousness in entry meant he could see a CEO or a board member eye to eye and could be taken as seriously as he wanted to be. A real master of imagery. And it's also this attitude he has, this calm nature that, again, you will be gleaned from being able to read his book and watch him in interviews, that you can see that would also have an impact on perception. And that's something you can control right away. So even if you don't have the means to, let's say, buy an expensive suit, although not entirely necessary, and you wanted to have some sort of positive impact on your perception, then know that your attitude will be a big, big deal. It might not be the first order effect of wearing the right clothes or entering the room with the right people or having the right posture and walk. Of course, something you can actually work on, but having the right attitude is that second layer that will be extremely important for someone to continue to take you seriously after you might have had that first layer. There's no point having the first layer correct if then the thing that precedes it doesn't match the image, right? So that's something powerful to take away here. I'm going to also just extend this by saying that 2 years later, that initial career progress, that moment was actually kind of slow. It meant that he didn't really get what he wanted from Jam Master Jay. He wasn't getting undivided attention. He wasn't getting, although he credits Jam Master Jay for helping him actually increase his ability to write hooks, something that 50 Cent is actually very famous for in the hip hop scene, having those very catchy hooks. He didn't feel he was getting the most from that experience. So one day he sees record executive Corey Rooney of Sony Records or Columbia Records outside a barbershop in Queens. And he really found his opportunity. He actually walks up to Corey, who was sat in his car. And I actually watched an interview with Corey Rooney that was gold in itself, that recalled that 50 Cent was dressed in a hood and he was on his own and he walked up to the car almost quite thuggishly. And so talk about perception. Corey Rooney thought 50 Cent might rob him. We're talking about someone who's already a signed artist and a rapper, but he still felt by his look that he might actually get robbed. 50 actually produced a mixtape and put it in, or asked Rooney if he could put it and play it in his car, which he did. But then during that interaction, Rooney's phone rang. You can imagine, as a Sony executive, he's probably very busy. So he takes this call, but 50 Cent, thinking that he wasn't paying attention to the music, then says, give me back the CD, you're mad old school, kind of insults him and takes the CD and walks away. Rooney kind of actually later mentions he was wondering, like, what's the matter with this guy? But, he really did think, wow, what he heard was great. He was listening, he was paying attention, and he really thought, wow, this guy could actually even be the next Jay-Z. And if you watch that interview with Corey Rooney, he says he's so happy to see what 50 Cent has done, because obviously it's worth noting that, again, that he was dropped from Columbia Records and he never got to release that first album. So Corey Rooney didn't get to be involved in anything that 50 Cent actually produced and released into the world, at least officially. And yet Corey Rooney is very happy to see 50 Cent for everything that he's done and for doing everything as he said he was going to do. And this is something I really thought was gold and not really mentioned much in the zeitgeist of and the story of 50 Cent. But 2 days after that initial meeting with 50 Cent, Rooney, he actually reached out to 50 and he said, come with me and let's take a ride to Bearsville, New York, upstate New York, which is a 2-hour drive. And I looked into this, and Bearsville, New York is where the production company Trackmasters had a studio where they would actually record in conjunction with Columbia Records a lot of songs with their kind of highest priority artists. And it was there that Rooney took, so you can see where Rooney's already imagining 50 to be this great rapper, this great artist to unlock. And so he took 50 Cent straight, 2 days after that interaction, straight to Bearsville to start recording. But it was in that car ride that was 2 hours that he said 50 spent the whole 2 hours saying, kind of laying out his career roadmap ahead. And this was, what was it, at the age of 24? He talks about wanting to rap and focus on it for a while, but then that he was going to shift and build bridges into other forms of art, into movies, into television, which he's gone on to do. But he was saying this in his early 20s. He was saying this, and he was effectively calling his shot from a very young age. And he was always desiring a career that was multifaceted and always wanted to create things in many different domains, which he expresses in his book very well, how humble he is to recognize that they are different domains and that you can't just jump from one to the other. It would take sacrifice. It would take, at one point, he takes less pay in order to focus on TV production. Instead of making the millions he would have done touring as a music artist, he decides, no, I'm going to sacrifice now for the long term and work on TV production and to be able to make the moves that he wanted to as an artist. Another thing to keep in mind there, that sometimes you'll have to take a pay cut in order to increase your long-term value as you acquire more skills. The value you get from those jobs being that you will acquire the type of skills that will make you a more versatile and more expansive artist. So always keep that in mind as well, that short-term gains, especially financial, can often be a blinding trap. But there's something here about his focus, that nothing he's done has been something that he's stumbled into. And I think that's the thing that Corey Rooney is most impressed by, is his intentionality, and something you might have gathered already by now, but we can get into a little bit more. It's here that I want to talk about his 2002 mixtape run. His prolific nature is already something you can find from his album Power of a Dollar, which he had 18 songs on, but he actually recorded 36 songs for it in 2 weeks in Bearsville, the place that Rooney took him. So there's a prolific nature to the speed and energy with which 50 Cent could record. I think of artists like Tupac, who had notoriously done hundreds and hundreds of songs. He was just, efficient with his time, but he was also extremely dedicated and focused and prolific. He would just continuously create. And I think that's something just to really keep in mind as an artist. You might be famous for one or two things. 50 Cent's going to be known by most people by songs like In the Club or 21 Questions. But the reality is he's likely made countless songs that you will never hear. And the point there is that, you should never slow your rate of progress just because of the perception that others might have about your work. And there's a time period I really wanted to highlight here, which is in 2002, he had this mixtape run. So you can imagine this is coming off the back of having been shot, not being signed to any record labels. He releases Guess Who's Back in April 2002, 50 Cent Is the Future in June of 2002, No Mercy, No Fear in August of 2002, and God's Plan in October of 2002. And this all happens the year before, obviously being signed with Interscope or Shady Records and releasing Get Rich or Die Trying. And what's worth noting here is that he recorded over 30 songs with his business partner, Shah Money XL. And there's an interview where Mark LaBelle of Shady Records said that Jackson used the mixtape run circuit to his advantage. He took all the hottest beats from every artist and flipped them and wrote better hooks. Then they got the mixtapes into the market and all the mixtape DJs were messing with them. That he created his own momentum, the kind of momentum that perhaps a record label would usually offer you, and that perhaps Columbia Records were initially offering with the Power of the Dollar. He was actually giving himself, and we're gonna get into this quite significantly because it's a very key part of his story and should be very inspirational for any of those artists listening who have felt that they need and require some sort of industry standard validation in order to make it big. Especially in a world like now where we have social media and it's easier than ever to share your work. I mean, you listening to this podcast is probably a product of how easy it is for me to share my work. In the same vein, you can do the same now, but 50 Cent lived in a time before social media, before the internet, or at least his initial career sat in that time period. At this time period, we had issues like bootlegging, which is effectively a larger sharing of music, be it outside of a monetizable realm, was actually a really major issue in hip hop. And those industry experts that were making, or industry players who were making so much money off CD sales, were really annoyed and frustrated by bootlegging, because it cut out of the process, financially. And they would usually kind of get leaked by insiders that worked in the industry, be it people that probably even very close to the artist would actually help to release the music early through bootlegging and would make money themselves outside of the artist's reach. A very nefarious practice, but something that 50 Cent mentions in Hustle Harder, Hustle Smarter. He talks about how I saw the situation completely different from those major label artists because I needed a buzz. I actively wanted my music to get bootlegged. To make it happen, I hatched a plan. So he saw this as an opportunity. He says, no one would give me a record deal, but I decided to put 50 Cent is the Future out on my own anyway. The key was to do everything possible to give it the appearance of being a major label release. I hired a photographer to shoot the front cover and a designer to create a package that looked like a regular release. I even put a fake barcode on the back cover to make it look as official as possible. Then I had my people leak the album to every bootlegger that would take it. And something to note here is how, again, artists would often seek validation from labels and those established media companies. And in part, it's likely that whilst they might be seeking validation, it's also a means of looking for investment. But again, this is something we can learn from 50. He, in effect, said, why should labels invest in me if I haven't invested in myself? And so he went and hired the photographer for the shoot. He then went and hired a designer. These are things that label will do for you, but he realized he could do it himself. And of course, remember, you are the one that knows your work best. So you're going to be able to market it best, really. Don't expect others to know how to sell your work better than you. Just learn how to market yourself. And this is something that he figured out. He realized that no one's going to care about his product as much as he is. And he says, my plan worked to perfection. The bootleggers quickly started pushing my album, not realizing they'd stolen something that I was actually trying to give away. All over the city, on multiple street corners, word began to spread about the new 50 Cent album that wasn't available in stores. You had to know the right bootlegger to get your hands on it because it was so hard to find. It instantly became a cool thing to have. Its perceived exclusivity only drove higher interest. And this reminds me of Nipsey Hussle, another great artist that I will one day make an episode on, who released a mixtape that cost $100. And you might think, why would you pay $100 for a mixtape? A, it's not even an official album. B, I mean, in the world we live in now where music's so easily accessible, $100 seems ridiculous almost. But he had a limited run. He only had 1,000 copies of this mixtape. It's called Crenshaw. And it's notorious that he had it up for only 24 hours. So there was a pop-up store in LA. And Jay-Z actually turned up to kind of respect the hustle and actually bought 100 of those 1,000 copies. So obviously times $100 by 100, you got 10,000, effectively $10,000 worth. So Jay-Z kind of effectively paid $10,000 to commend Nipsey Hussle. And he remained as an independent artist for most of the time he was alive. And he actually notes, and I wanted to quote this, so I looked into it. He said, I think a major label has to be like a venture capitalist. They have to put forth the resources, the relationships, staff, and professionals to take an artist from 60 to 100. Note that he's not talking about 0 to 100. He says 60 to 100. But they have to respect the artist took his own situation from 0 to 60. And the only way to respect that is in the structure of the deal. Nipsey Hussle is talking about the leverage that you can create bringing forward into these deals when you've already taken yourself from 0 to 60. But he's also noting that there is value in these labels, that they can take you from, being someone that's well known to being extremely well known, perhaps can get you into the right associations, be it through TV or through traditional media. However, taking yourself from 0 to 60 is the crucial part of the story here. And his Mixtape Run was a way of driving interest. It was a very novel thing to do, to charge so much for a mixtape. And it likely harkens back to 50 Cent's Mixtape Run, and he was likely inspired by it. There was actually a fun instance where one of 50 Cent's friends who didn't know about the plan saw a bootlegger selling the mixtape on a table, and so thinking the guy was ripping 50 Cent off, he actually flipped the table over and punched the guy in the face. I mean, terrible situation, but 50 Cent actually later told him the plan and told him to go back and actually buy a few copies from him and of course his other people on the streets, to kind of signal that the streets really wanted this project. It was that in demand, and the perception of demand would naturally increase supply, and then that increased supply would signal to others that there was this higher demand. And so, you know, that's kind of how 50 Cent was able to really continue to leverage this mixtape run that is so important as part of his career. He says one of the major values that labels offered artists was their distribution network. The labels control which albums got into the right stores, as well as how they were displayed and promoted. By leaking my own music, I'd figured out a way around that. Those bootleggers became my own distribution network. And as long as there was demand, they were going to keep making copies and getting my music, and I put here in brackets, most importantly, my name out there. I want to end this section by quoting a line from 50 Cent, which I think encapsulates all of this so beautifully. He says, "I wasn't content sitting around hoping that someone would decide I was hot. I lit my own fire instead." And, you know, naturally the conclusion was to this mixtape run was that it landed in Eminem's hand, who introduced him to Dr. Dre, and then was signed to Shady Aftermath and Interscope Records, where he released his debut album, Get Rich or Die Trying, which debuted at #1 on Billboard and sold over 800,000 copies in the first 4 days. So truly incredible build-up that, again, took 50 Cent from 0 to 60 before he was taken from 60 to 100. But I want to also note not just 50 Cent's own self-observation and self-analysis, but also to that of culture and how observant he is of culture. You know, 50 Cent is extremely observant, and particularly when it comes to the evolution of how cultures shift and change. He says, hip-hop loves things that are damaged. It's been the defining trait of the culture. Think about it. Every few years, a new dangerous or damaged rapper appears on the scene and captivates the culture. 50 Cent kind of then goes on to outline how it started with like the 80s groups like Grandmaster Flash and Furious 5, and then how they kind of broke onto the scene and they were kind of considered dangerous, and how America had never seen anything like that before. But then by the late 80s, NWA comes along, and NWA, you know, made those kind of guys that seem like safe and cuddly almost by comparison. And, you know, he says here, for several years, NWA was the illest thing on site until Wu-Tang stormed onto the scene and grabbed that mantle. They were young, wild, and out of control. The culture couldn't get enough. So you see, no matter how dangerous you might be perceived at one point, it only takes a little while before someone appears even more dangerous, and that really captivates the spotlight and energy of hip-hop culture. It's the thing that draws audiences in. And he talks about Tupac as well, and it's clear that Tupac is a key inspiration for 50 Cent, but it's more important to note that 50 Cent clearly studied his genre and knows it very intimately, and naturally knows that, as he was himself, that the dangerous artists were the ones that really caught the attention of those in hip-hop. And there are lots of artists across other genres and other mediums even that danger becomes their kind of key entry point into the culture. So many paintings convey this sort of danger. Just go to your National Gallery and you'll notice that a lot of paintings invoke danger and these frightening images of violence, and that's not to promote violence at all, but to promote the artistry of violence, the capturing of what already exists in the world. You know, danger and violence are things that are extremely prevalent in the world. We can't ignore it, so let's at least make art from it. But here's an interesting reflection that 50 Cent makes. He says, the fatal mistake a lot of rappers make is refusing to accept the pattern. That in their minds, they're still damaged, still the same person who broke into the game, but people tend to stop viewing you as human once you taste success. In the public's mind, Once you've made it, you're fixed. Time to move on to the next one. You know, that there's something here that perhaps danger and hunger associated with danger and desperation is relatable, but success is not. You know, perhaps the damaged part of the artist was the thing that people related to, being slightly broken. It reminds me of the same reason we're kind of drawn to the anti-heroes and shows like Breaking Bad or Sopranos or Mad Men. We kind of subconsciously love the contrasting and complex characters who decide to break the rules and, you know, live in a more dangerous world. And this kind of thing is very perhaps relatable, but once they arrive at a place where they're seemingly fixed, and especially when it comes to things related to, you know, economics and finance, one would perceive that a lot of the danger comes from the desperation in order to acquire finances. But as soon as those finances are acquired, then surely they wouldn't need to continue to have that aggressive and desperate stance. And perhaps having that same stance once you're financially successful, at least, seems to come across as fake, the very thing that 50 Cent would obviously want to avoid. He said, "The perceptive artists accept this reality and evolve. The non-observant keeps fighting the inevitable all the way into obscurity." He then notes artists like Ice Cube or Dr. Dre as examples of people who are able to evolve beyond the phenomenon by effectively shifting out of the upcoming rapper spotlight and into another medium. He says, those guys were smart enough and humble enough to understand that the public can never be wrong. When people don't respond to what you give them, they're telling you they've moved on, loud and clear. If you don't hear them, then you're just not listening. And what I absolutely love about this reflection is how he takes his words and ideas and puts them into practice. He says he's actually still passionate about making music, but that it's not his defining identity anymore. He said, let's say I went to the studio one night and was able to capture the magic that's behind every great song. I might have just created great content, but I still probably wouldn't release those songs myself. Instead, I'd give all those songs to a solid young blood, someone who seems like they're really damaged. Why? Because I'm realistic enough to concede that the public is going to be more receptive to it coming from their voice than from my own. Why not give that next new talented young artist something that they can take him to the next level? And I can have a piece of the song and he can taste success. Sounds like a good deal for everyone. This brings me actually to a point about talking about 50 Cent in the past tense. He is still an artist today. He is still creating today. I notice that whenever I bring up 50 Cent to a friend, they think of him as a rapper from the past, noting that he hasn't really released anything, let's say, since his last album, which was in 2014. But you can see here that he still has his finger on the pulse, even today. In fact, he has it on the pulse so much so that he recognizes that the moment for him has passed, but for others is just beginning. And why not facilitate and be a part of that as well? So that's an incredibly humble thing for him to recognize as a person in his position, and to not crave and desire being in the spotlight as much as he used to, at least in this domain, and rather to be almost like the godfather figure who sits in the background, passing on wisdom and insights and ideas, fully packaged ideas sometimes, to new and upcoming dons of their own. He says, I've accepted that my role in the culture has changed. That doesn't mean I can't still impact it. I just have to utilize different methods. And, you know, this is where I now move him into a new role. And that new role includes him being a television producer. This is really where he is today, and what cements his artistry as being that of legacy, something sustainable and something that moves him beyond being locked in place with one moment in the spotlight, but rather something that continues to be creative and an expression of his mastery of art itself. He recognizes and captures cultural evolutions. He says being willing to evolve in your own position is just part of the battle. You have to be willing to change with your culture too. There are a lot of reasons why Power, and that's his show, has become a bona fide hit. But one of the biggest factors behind the show's success is that I constructed it to reflect my audience's evolution. Whilst 50 Cent at this point was going to be a newcomer in the TV world. He was definitely about to show how much of a master artist he was and how deeply he understood people. He said, "I conceived power from my audience and for my audience only. I wasn't trying to tap into a new demographic or attract a wider viewership. I understood I was only going to get one chance to do it right with power. And in order to do that, I had to speak directly to my people. I was very confident in my ability to do that. I am nothing if not observant." That's very true. He says, "I spent a lot of time paying attention to my fans over the years." Again, perhaps let's repeat that because that's a really key theme with 50 Cent. He said, "I was very confident in my ability to do that. I am nothing if not observant. And I spent a lot of time paying attention to my fans over the years." He kind of reminds me of this word in Japanese called jifu, which means a confidence that derives from competence. You know, he was entering a new domain, and yet he had a deep confidence that stemmed from his observational skills around culture and how people think and how people feel. 50 Cent is both extremely confident, but it really comes from his ability to be observant. He said, when I first came out, my core audience was young, college educated kids or 20-somethings who were going out to clubs for the first time. So what did I do? I made music that I knew would connect with their lifestyle. Let's take the famous line, "Go shorty, it's your birthday. We're going to party like it's your birthday." That had to connect. My audience was in the clubs every night, and it was going to be somebody's birthday. That line reflected how they were living, and it could not lose its relevancy. But by 2014, my audience wasn't in the clubs every night anymore. If it was their birthday, they might be having a quiet celebration at home with their spouse and young kids. They were maturing. This is why I built the show around the themes that would speak to an older audience. What happens when a love from someone's youth unexpectedly reappears on the scene? What is the fallout when a husband and wife doesn't have the same vision for their future? Or when a son betrays his father? Those are the themes that resonate with adults. At the same time, I needed to capture the energy and excitement my audience felt when they were still out living the life, still partying and getting into drama every night. That's why I insisted on power being very graphic, especially sexually. It needed that spark. We shocked the network and the entire industry by pulling in very strong ratings on a Saturday night. The executives couldn't figure it out at first, but I knew exactly what was happening. My audience was staying home on Saturday nights. I was giving them that old energy, but from the comfort and safety of their couch. The incredible thing about 50 Cent is his observational skills, and I've naturally noted this many times over this podcast, but his ability to take his observations and turn them into art is what allows him to sit above his peers. And you know, there is so much to learn from this artist. I'm going to end the podcast here, although there is a lot that I probably would continue to talk about, and perhaps we'll leave this for a part 2 in the future. I'm more than happy to revisit this book. You know, there's so much to learn from him. And I will say that if you want to know what I think is 50 Cent's best piece of art ever made, I've made a free downloadable PDF available in the link in the podcast show notes, where I talk about the piece and dissect why I think it's his magnum opus, but more importantly, give insight as to what you can learn from it and what you can learn about 50 Cent as an artist, surmising all the different ideas that I've kind of stipulated throughout this podcast and brought them together for what I think is his greatest piece of work. So you can do that by clicking the link in the show notes. And with that, I've been Justin Campbell Platt. This is Icons. Thank you for listening.